Welcome to Part 6 of Murder on Broadway. Visit brooksaudiobooks.com for an awesome collection of unique, full-length audiobooks. And be sure to subscribe to be notified when new books are released. Chapter 26. Reconstructing the Crime. Monday, June 17, noon. After Quentin finished speaking, an awkward silence hung in the air for several minutes. Stanford slumped deep in his chair, staring blankly ahead. Oscar, on the other hand, was watching Quentin with a reluctant admiration. The cornerstone of his case against Harley had just been knocked out, and the structure he had carefully built was now wobbling dangerously. Stanford grasped this reality, and the realization shattered his hopes. "I wish your insights were more useful," he complained, turning his glare toward Quentin. "This latest revelation puts us right back where we started." "Oh, don't be so negative. Let's face the future with optimism. Want to hear my theory? It's bursting with possibilities." He settled back comfortably in his chair. Porter needed money. No doubt his supply of silk shirts was running low. After his failed attempt to extort it from the lady a week before her death, he came here last Monday night. He had found out she would be out, and he planned to wait for her because she had probably refused to see him in the usual social manner. Knowing the side door was bolted at night, he didn't want to be seen entering the apartment, so he came up with a little scheme to unbolt the door for himself under the pretense of a meaningless visit at 9:30. Once he had unbolted the door, he slipped back through the alley and got into the apartment sometime before 11. When the lady returned with a companion, he quickly hid in the closet and waited until her escort left. Then he emerged, startling her into a scream. But when she recognized him, she assured Trafford, who was now banging on the door, that it was all a misunderstanding. So Trafford moved along and played poker. A financial argument between Porter and the lady, most likely a heated dispute, followed. Just then, the telephone rang, and Porter picked it up only to hear that the Cardinal was out. The argument resumed, but soon another suitor came into the picture. Whether he rang the bell or let himself in with a key, I can't say. Most likely the latter, since the phone operator had no clue he was coming. Porter tucked himself away in the closet again, and thankfully he had the sense to lock the door. Naturally, he put his eye to the keyhole to see who the second intruder was. Quentin pointed toward the closet door. If you look closely, the keyhole aligns with the davenport. As Porter peered out into the room, he was met with a sight that chilled him to the bone. The new arrival, perhaps in the midst of some sweet exchange, seized the lady by the throat and began to strangle her. Can you imagine Porter's feelings, my dear Stanford? There he was, crouched in a dark closet, mere feet away from a murderer in the act of killing a woman. Poor Anton. It's no wonder he was frozen in fear, unable to speak. He saw what he believed to be maniacal rage in the strangler's eyes. The man must have been quite strong, while Porter was slender and almost delicate. No, thank you. Porter wanted no part of that. He stayed perfectly still, and I can't say I blame him, can you? He raised an eyebrow, as if questioning. What happened next? Well, we may never know, now that Porter, the horrified witness, has passed on. But I can guess that the strangler pulled out that black document box, opened it with a key he'd taken from the lady's handbag, and retrieved a good number of incriminating papers. Then, I imagine, the real chaos began. The gentleman set about wrecking the apartment to create the appearance of a professional burglary. He ripped the lace from the lady's gown and cut her shoulder strap. He snatched her orchid corsage and tossed it into her lap. He stripped her of her rings and bracelets and yanked the pendant from its chain. After that, he knocked over the lamp, rummaged through the escritoire, tore apart the Boule cabinet, smashed the mirror, overturned the chairs, and ripped down the draperies. Porter kept his eye fixed on the keyhole, caught in a mix of fascination and fear, too frightened to move, terrified he'd be found and forced to join his former sweetheart. By now, he was surely convinced that the man outside was a complete madman. Honestly, I can't say I envy Porter's predicament. It was precarious, to say the least. The chaos continued all around him. Even when he could no longer see what was happening, he could hear the destruction. And there he was, trapped like a rat with no way out. A truly harrowing situation, my word. Quentin took a puff of his cigarette, before shifting slightly in his seat. Stanford, I'm sure the worst moment of Porter's tumultuous journey came when that mysterious wrecking figure tried to open the closet door where he was hiding. Just imagine it, cornered, with a potential killer just inches away, rattling that flimsy door made of white pine. Can you picture the relief he must have felt when the murderer finally let go of the knob and walked away? It's a miracle he didn't faint from the shock, but he didn't. He stayed there, listening and watching in a sort of paralyzed panic, until he finally heard the intruder leave the apartment. Then, with weak knees and a cold sweat, he stepped out to survey the scene. Quentin looked around the room. Not a lovely sight, is it? And there on the davenport lay the lady's lifeless body. That corpse was the source of Porter's greatest horror. He took a staggering step toward the table to get a closer look, bracing himself with his right hand. That's how you ended up with your fingerprints, Sergeant. Then the weight of his reality hit him. Here he was, alone with a murder victim. Everyone knew he had been close to her. He had a criminal record as a burglar. Who would believe he was innocent? Even though he probably recognized the man responsible for all this, he was in no position to share his story. Everything was stacked against him, sneaking in, being in the house at 9:30, his connection to the girl, his profession, and his reputation. He didn't stand a chance. I ask you, Stanford, would you believe his story? Forget that for now, Stanford shot back. Let's hear your theory. He and Oscar were listening intently. My theory from this point on, Quentin continued, is what you might call self-propelling. It moves forward on its own momentum, so to speak. Porter was faced with the urgent task of escaping and covering his tracks. In that pressure, his mind became sharp and extremely active. His life depended on his success. He started thinking wildly. He could have slipped out through the side door right away without being noticed, but then that door would be found unbolted. And that fact, alongside his earlier visit that night, would suggest how he had unbolted the door. No, that plan wouldn't work. Absolutely not. He knew he would likely be suspected of the murder due to his shady ties with the woman and his overall character. Motive, opportunity, means, and his own record, all were against him. He had to cover his tracks, you see, or his days as a charming rogue would be over. Quite the predicament. He understood that if he managed to leave with the side door bolted from the inside, he'd be relatively safe. No one could explain how he came or went. It would give him his only possible alibi. A weak one, certainly, but with a decent lawyer he could probably make it stick. Surely he looked for other exits, but he encountered obstacles at every turn. The side door was his last hope. How could he make it work? Quentin stood and stretched. That's my cunning theory. Porter was caught in a trap, and with his sharp, tricky mind, he figured a way out. He likely spent hours pacing between these two rooms before he settled on his plan, and it's not surprising if he occasionally muttered, "Oh, my God," while trying to think it through. As for his use of the tweezers, I believe he came up with that idea fairly quickly. You see, Sergeant, this trick of locking a door from the inside isn't new. There are many documented instances of it in European criminal literature. In fact, in Professor Hans Gross's Criminology Handbook, there's an entire chapter dedicated to the methods that burglars use for unauthorized entries and exits. However, those techniques all involve locking, not bolting, doors. The principle is similar, but the technique is different. To lock a door from the inside, one typically inserts a needle or a slender pin through the bow of the key and pulls it down with a string. The challenge here is that the side door of this house doesn't have a lock or key, nor is there a bow on the bolt handle. Now, as the clever Porter nervously paced and searched for inspiration, he probably spotted the tweezers on the lady's dressing table. After all, no modern woman is without these little tools for grooming her brows. Once he noticed them, his problem was solved. The only thing left was to put the device to the test. Before he made his escape, however, he pried open the jewel case that the other man had merely dented and found the solitaire diamond ring he later tried to pawn. He then thought he wiped away all his fingerprints, neglecting to clean the inside door knob of the closet and overlooking the handprint left on the table. After that, he let himself out quietly and rebolted the side door just as I had done, tucking the tweezers into his waistcoat pocket and forgetting about them entirely. The treatise Quentin referenced was the Handbuch für Untersuchungsrichter als System, der Kriminalistik. Oscar nodded sagely. No matter how clever a criminal may be, they always miss something. Why target criminals with your criticism, Sergeant? Quentin asked lazily. Is there anyone in this flawed world who doesn't overlook something? Even the police, if I may remind you, overlooked the tweezers. He flashed a benign smile at Oscar. Oscar grunted. His cigar had gone cold, and he lit it again with care. What's your take on this, Mr. Stanford? The situation doesn't seem any clearer, Stanford replied with a frown. My theory isn't exactly a revelation, Quentin admitted, but it's not completely in the dark either. There are certain conclusions we can draw from my speculations. For instance, Porter either knew or recognized the murderer, and once he managed to escape the apartment and gain some confidence, he likely blackmailed his killer. His death was just another example of our unknown assailant's tendency to eliminate people who annoy him. Moreover, my theory explains the chiseled jewel case, the fingerprints, the untouched closet, and the discovery of the gems in the trash bin. The person who took them clearly didn't want them, you see, and Porter's silence. It also accounts for the side door being both unlatched and latched again. Yes, Stanford sighed. It clears up everything except for the one vital detail, the identity of the murderer. Exactly, Quentin agreed. Let's grab some lunch. Morose and puzzled, Oscar set off for police headquarters, while Stanford, Quentin, and I headed to Delmonico, opting for the main dining room over the grill. The focus of the case now seems to be on Brady and Julian, Stanford remarked after our lunch. If your theory that the same person killed both Porter and the Cardinal holds true, then Jensen is no longer a suspect, as he was certainly in the Episcopal Hospital Saturday night. Exactly, Quentin concurred. The doctor is indisputably out of the picture. Yes, Brady and Julian, they're the tempting duo. I can't see any way to look beyond them. He frowned, sipping his coffee. My initial group of suspects is shrinking, and I'm not pleased about it. It limits the possibilities too much. There's no room for the imagination when faced with only two choices. What if we were to get rid of Brady and Julian? Where would that leave us? Nowhere, just nowhere. Yet one of the four of them is guilty. Let's hold on to that comforting thought. It can't be Trafford and it can't be Jensen. That leaves Brady and Julian. 2 out of 4 means we're left with 2. Basic math, right. The only problem is that this case isn't straightforward. Good heavens, no. I wonder how the math would work out if we used algebra or even spherical trigonometry or differential calculus. Let's throw it into the 4th dimension, or the 5th, or the 6th. He cradled his temples in his hands. Oh, please, Stanford, promise me you'll find me a kind, gentle keeper. I understand how you feel. I've been in the same mental state for a week now. It's this quartet idea that's driving me insane, Quentin lamented. It tears at me to have my group cut down so brutally. I had my hopes set on that quartet, and now it's just a pair. My sense of order and balance has been shattered. I want my quartet back. I'm afraid you'll have to settle for just 2 of them, Stanford replied wearily. One of them doesn't qualify, and the other is in bed. You might consider sending some flowers to the hospital if that would lift your spirits. One is in bed, Quentin echoed. Well, a certainty. And 1 from 4 leaves 3, more math, 3. On the other hand, there's no such thing as a straight line. All lines are curved. They describe circles in space. They may look straight, but they're not. Appearances, you know, so misleading. Let's embrace the silence and trade sight for thought. He looked out through the large windows onto 5th Avenue. For several moments, he sat there, smoking thoughtfully. When he spoke again, his voice was steady and measured. Stanford, would it be too much trouble for you to invite Julian, Brady, and Trafford to spend an evening, say this evening, at your apartment? Stanford set his cup down with a sharp noise and regarded Quentin with suspicion. What new nonsense is this? Enough of that. Just answer my question. Well, of course, I could arrange it, Stanford replied cautiously. They're all pretty much under my supervision at the moment. So such an invitation would fit the situation perfectly, wouldn't it? They wouldn't dare refuse you, my dear, would they? No, I doubt they would. And if, once they were gathered in your rooms, you suggested a few rounds of poker, they'd likely go along with it, without thinking it hard. Probably, Stanford said, taken aback by Quentin's surprising request. I know both Brady and Trafford play, and I imagine Julian knows how. But why poker? Are you serious, or has your rumored madness truly taken hold of you? Oh, I'm dead serious. Quentin's tone left no room for doubt. The game of poker is essential to my plan, you see. I knew Brady was skilled at it, and Trafford played with Judge Redfern last Monday night. That gave me a solid foundation for my strategy. We can assume Julian plays as well. He leaned in closer, speaking earnestly. 9/10 of poker, Stanford, is about psychology. If one understands the game, one can learn more about a man's true character at a poker table in an hour than through a year of casual acquaintance. You once teased me when I said I could lead you to the perpetrator of any crime by examining the crime itself. But of course, I need to know the man I'm leading you to. Otherwise, I can't connect the psychological hints of the crime with the nature of the culprit. In this case, I know the kind of person who committed the crime, but I'm not familiar enough with the suspects to identify the guilty one. After our poker game, I think I'll be able to tell you who orchestrated the Cardinal's murder. Not long ago, I stumbled upon an article by Dr. George A. Dorsey, an anthropology professor at the University of Chicago and author of Why We Behave Like Human Beings. The article provided compelling support for Quentin's theory. Dr. Dorsey wrote, "Poker is like a microcosm of life. A man's behavior at the poker table reflects how he acts in the world. His success or failure depends on how his body reacts to the pressures exerted by the game." I've dedicated my life to studying humanity from both an anthropological and psychological perspective, and I've yet to find a better way to observe human behavior than by watching how men respond when I raise the stakes. In a poker game, a psychologist's verbal, visceral, and physical responses are on full display. I can honestly say that I have learned about people through poker. Stanford looked at him in disbelief. He knew that Quentin was an exceptional poker player with an uncanny understanding of the psychological aspects of the game, but he was taken aback by Quentin's claim that he could solve the Simon murder through it. Despite this, Quentin spoke with such unwavering sincerity that it made an impression on Stanford. He could almost read Stanford's thoughts as clearly as if he had spoken them aloud. Stanford was likely recalling how, in a previous murder case, Quentin had accurately identified the culprit through a similar process of psychological deduction. He was also reminding himself that, no matter how perplexing or outrageous Quentin's proposals seemed, there was often a solid reason behind them. "Damn it," he finally exclaimed. "This whole scheme seems ridiculous, but if you genuinely want to play poker with these men, I have no particular objection. Just know that it probably won't lead anywhere. I can tell you that much in advance. It's complete nonsense to think you can find the guilty party through such absurd methods." "Ah, well," Quentin sighed, "a bit of pointless fun won't hurt us. But why include Trafford? Honestly, I have no idea, aside from the fact that he's part of my group. We could use an extra set of hands. Just don't come back later saying I should lock him up for murder. I'd have to draw the line. As strange as it may sound to you, I wouldn't want to prosecute someone if I knew it was physically impossible for him to have committed the crime." "Well," Quentin replied, "the only things that really stand in the way of what's physically impossible are concrete facts, and those facts can be notoriously misleading. You lawyers would do better to ignore them altogether." Stanford didn't even bother to respond to such blasphemy, but his look at Quentin spoke volumes. Chapter 27. Game of Poker. Monday, June 17, 9 p.m. Quentin and I returned home after lunch, and around 4 o'clock, Stanford called to let us know he had arranged everything for the evening with Trafford, Julian, and Brady. As soon as he got off the phone, Quentin left the house and didn't come back until nearly 8. I was dying to know what he was up to, but he wouldn't tell me a thing. When we headed downstairs to the waiting car a little before 9, I noticed a man I didn't recognize in the backseat, and immediately connected him to Quentin's secretive behavior. "I've invited Mr. Allen to join us tonight," Quentin said as he introduced us. "You don't play poker, and we really need another player to make the game interesting. By the way, Mr. Allen is an old rival of mine." I was astonished that Quentin, seemingly without asking, would bring an uninvited guest to Stanford's apartment, but I was just as taken aback by the appearance of the man himself. He was quite short, with sharp and crafty features. His hair, visible beneath his stylishly tilted hat, was black and sleek like the painted hair on a Japanese doll. I also noticed that his evening tie was decorated with tiny white forget-me-nots, and his shirt front boasted diamond studs. The contrast between him and the impeccably dressed and thoroughly refined Quentin was striking. I wondered what their connection was. It was clear that it was neither social nor intellectual. Brady and Julian were already there when we stepped into Stanford's drawing room, and a few minutes later, Trafford joined us. After the formalities were done, we settled comfortably around the open log fire, enjoying excellent Scotch highballs and smoking. Stanford welcomed Mr. Allen with warmth, but his occasional glances toward the man made it evident he was struggling to reconcile Allen's appearance with Quentin's endorsement. There was an undercurrent of tension beneath the seemingly polite and affected camaraderie of our little gathering. The circumstances were hardly suited for spontaneity. Here were 3 men, all of whom were aware that they had shared an interest in the same woman, and the reason they had been brought together was the shocking fact that this woman had been murdered. Stanford, however, approached the situation with such skill that he managed to make each man feel as if he were an unbiased observer called to contemplate a theoretical issue. He began by explaining that this meeting had come about due to his inability to make any progress on the murder investigation. By encouraging a casual discussion free of any formality or pressure, he hoped to uncover some insight that might lead them in a promising direction. His friendly demeanor helped ease the initial tension in the room. As the conversation progressed, I observed the varied reactions among the men. Brady spoke with bitterness regarding his role in the events, leaning more towards self-blame than offering suggestions. Julian was chatty and pretentiously open, but beneath his words lay a hint of apologetic caution. In contrast, Trafford seemed reluctant to address the issue, maintaining a constantly reserved posture. He answered Stanford's inquiries politely, but couldn't quite mask his annoyance at being pulled into this open dialogue. Quentin had little to contribute, offering only occasional comments directed at Stanford. Allen remained silent throughout, watching the others with a sly amusement. Overall, the entire conversation struck me as utterly pointless. If Stanford had hoped to gain any valuable information, he would have faced disappointment. It became clear to me that he was merely trying to justify his unconventional approach and set the stage for the poker game that Quentin had requested. When it was time to introduce that topic, he faced no difficulty at all. It was precisely 11 o'clock when he made the suggestion. His tone was gracious and unpretentious. However, by framing his invitation as a personal request, he made it nearly impossible to decline. I sensed that his approach was unnecessary. Both Brady and Trafford appeared genuinely relieved to set aside an unpleasant discussion in favor of playing cards, and Quentin and Allen readily agreed. Only Julian declined. He admitted that he was only slightly familiar with the game and did not particularly enjoy it, though he expressed a keen interest in watching the others play. Quentin encouraged him to change his mind, but it was to no avail. Ultimately, Stanford instructed his servant to prepare the table for 5. I observed that Quentin waited until Allen had settled in before he took the chair to his right. Brady occupied the seat to Allen's left, followed by Trafford on Quentin's right, and then Stanford. Julian positioned himself midway, behind Stanford and Brady. Brady initially proposed a modest limit, but Trafford immediately suggested much larger stakes. Then Quentin raised the ante even higher, and when both Stanford and Allen expressed their agreement, his amount was accepted, The prices placed on the chips left me momentarily stunned, and even Julian let out a soft whistle. It became clear within the first 10 minutes that all 5 men at the table were exceptionally skilled players. For the first time that evening, Quentin's friend Alan seemed to find his comfort zone and appeared completely at ease. Alan won the first 2 hands, while Quentin took the third and fourth. Trafford then experienced a brief streak of good fortune, followed shortly by Stanford, who claimed a large jackpot that put him slightly ahead. Thus far, Brady was the only one losing, but within another half-hour, he managed to recover a significant portion of his losses. After that, Quentin began to pull ahead steadily, only to soon relinquish his winning streak to Alan. For a while, the game's fortunes were evenly balanced, but later, Brady and Trafford began to incur heavy losses. By 12:30, a heavy mood had settled over the party. The stakes were so high, and the bets shifted so quickly, that even for the wealthy players gathered there, the amounts changing hands were significant. Just before 1 o'clock, as the intensity of the game peaked, I saw Quentin steal a glance at Alan and wipe his brow with a handkerchief. To an outsider, the action would have seemed entirely ordinary, but I knew Quentin well enough to recognize the feigned nature of his gesture. At the same moment, I noticed that Alan was the one shuffling the cards in preparation for the deal. A puff of smoke from his cigar must have irritated his eye, causing him to blink and drop one of the cards to the floor. He quickly picked it up, reshuffled the deck, and placed it before Quentin to cut. The hand turned out to be a jackpot, with a small fortune in chips already piled on the table. Brady, Stanford, and Trafford opted to fold. This left the decision to Quentin, who bet a considerable amount. Alan immediately laid down his hand, but Brady chose to stay in. Stanford and Trafford both dropped out, leaving it a face-off between Quentin and Brady. Brady drew 1 card, while Quentin, having opened the betting, drew 2. Quentin made a modest bet, and Brady raised him significantly. Quentin responded with a smaller raise, but Brady quickly escalated, this time with a larger sum than before. Quentin hesitated, and then called his bet. Brady revealed his hand with a triumphant smile. "Straight flush, jack high," he declared. "Can you beat that?" "Not with a 2-card draw," Quentin replied with a hint of regret, laying down his cards to reveal 4 kings. About half an hour later, Quentin pulled out his handkerchief again and wiped his brow. As before, I noticed it was Alan's turn to deal, and that the hand was a jackpot that had been sweetened twice. Alan paused to sip his highball and light his cigar. After Quentin shuffled the cards, he dealt them out. Brady, Stanford, and Trafford folded, leaving Quentin to open with a bet covering the entire pot. Only Trafford stayed in, which turned the game into a duel between him and Quentin. Trafford requested 1 card, while Quentin chose to keep his hand as is. A tense silence enveloped us, the atmosphere thick with anticipation. I sensed that the others were equally aware of the charged energy in the room, all focused intently on the unfolding game. Quentin and Trafford, however, remained composed, their expressions revealing nothing. It was Quentin's turn to make a move. Without a word, he slid a stack of yellow chips into the center of the table, the largest bet of the game. Trafford quickly countered with a matching stack, then calmly counted the rest of his chips before pushing them into the pot with the palm of his hand. "The limit." Quentin shrugged slightly. "The pot, sir, is yours." He flashed a pleasant smile at Trafford and revealed his hand, laying it down face up to show his openers. He had 4 aces. "Wow, that's poker," Alan exclaimed, laughing. "Poker," Stanford echoed in disbelief. "You're going to play 4 aces with all that money on the table." Brady grunted his surprise, while Julian pursed his lips in disapproval. "No offense, Mr. Quentin," he said, "but looking at that move from a purely business standpoint, I'd say you gave up too soon." Trafford looked up. "You're mistaken about Mr. Quentin," he said. He played his hand flawlessly. His decision to fold, even with 4 aces, was the smart choice. "Absolutely," agreed Alan. "What a showdown that was." Trafford nodded, and then turned to Quentin, saying, Since it's unlikely we'll ever find ourselves in this exact situation again, the least I can do to show my respect for your keen insight is to satisfy your curiosity. I had nothing. With that, Trafford showed his hand, and gracefully gestured toward the upturned cards. Revealed were the 5, 6, 7, and 8 of clubs, along with a knave of hearts. I can't say I follow your logic, Mr. Trafford, Stanford admitted. Mr. Quentin had an advantage, and then he folded. Let's consider the situation, Trafford replied smoothly, maintaining an even tone. I would certainly have raised such a substantial part if I could have, after both you and Mr. Brady had folded. But since I chose to stay after Mr. Quentin opened with such a hefty amount, it's clear that I must have held either a 4 straight, a 4 flush, or a 4 straight flush. I believe it's fair to say that I'm too skilled a player to have stayed without such a hand. And I assure you, Stanford, interjected Quentin, that Mr. Trafford is skilled enough to have stayed only if he had a 4 straight flush. That's the only hand worth backing at betting odds of 2 to 1. You see, I had opened for the pot, and Mr. Trafford had to match half the amount already on the table to stay in the game, making it a 2 to 1 bet. Now, those odds aren't very generous, and any hand less than a 4 straight flush wouldn't justify the risk. With a 1-card draw, he had 2 chances in 47 of hitting a straight flush, 9 chances in 47 of hitting a flush, and 8 chances in 47 of hitting a straight. That gives him 19 chances in 47, which is over 1 in 3, of improving his hand into either a straight flush, a flush, or a straight. Exactly, Trafford agreed. However, after I drew my 1 card, the only question for Mr. Quentin was whether I had made my straight flush. If I hadn't made it, or had only drawn a straight or a flush, Mr. Quentin would have rightly figured that I wouldn't have called his big bet and raised it to the limit. Doing so under those circumstances would have been illogical poker. Not a single player in 1,000 would have taken such a chance on a mere bluff. So, if Mr. Quentin hadn't laid down his 4 aces when I raised him, he would have been downright reckless. It turned out, of course, that I was actually bluffing, but that doesn't change the fact that the sensible and logical thing for Mr. Quentin to do was to walk away. Quite right, Quentin nodded. As Mr. Trafford points out, not one player in 1,000 would have bet the maximum without having a completed straight flush, knowing I had a strong hand. Indeed, one might say that Mr. Trafford, by doing so, has introduced another layer of psychological nuance to the game. For, as you see, he analyzed my thinking and took his own reasoning a step further. Trafford acknowledged the compliment with a slight bow, and Brady reached for the cards, beginning to shuffle them. But the tension had dissipated, and the game didn't continue. Something, however, seemed off with Quentin. For a long time he sat frowning at his cigarette, sipping his highball in deep thought. After a while, he rose and walked to the mantel, where he studied a Cézanne watercolor he had given Stanford years ago. This action was a clear sign of his inner confusion. Eventually, when a lull fell over the conversation, he turned sharply and looked at Julian. "I say, Mr. Julian," he spoke with casual curiosity, "how come you've never developed a taste for poker? All good business people are gamblers at heart." "Sure they are," Julian replied, with thoughtful contemplation. "But poker isn't quite my idea of gambling, not at all. It's got too much strategy, and it just isn't fast enough for me, lacks the thrill, if you know what I mean. Roulette is my game. When I was in Monte Carlo last summer, I lost more money in 10 minutes than you gentlemen lost here all evening. But I get excitement for my money. I take it you're not fond of cards at all." "Not for games, no." Julian seemed to open up. "I don't mind betting on the draw of a card, for example, but none of that 2 out of 3 nonsense, you understand. I want my pleasures to come fast." He snapped his thick fingers several times to illustrate how quickly he wanted his pleasures to arrive. Quentin strolled over to the table and casually picked up a deck of cards. "What do you say to cutting once for $1,000? Julian immediately stood up. "You're on." Quentin handed the cards over, and Julian shuffled them. Then he set them down and made the cut. He revealed a 10. Quentin cut next and showed a king. "1,000 I owe you," Julian said, no more concerned than if it had been 10 cents. Quentin waited in silence, and Julian studied him with a crafty gaze. "I'll cut with you again, 2,000 this time. Sound good?" Quentin raised his eyebrows. "Double, absolutely." He shuffled the cards again and cut a 7. Julian's hand swooped down to reveal a 5. "Well, that's 3,000 I owe you," he remarked, his small eyes now narrowed to slits, holding his cigar firmly between his teeth. "Like to double it again, eh? 4,000 this time?" Quentin asked. Stanford looked at Quentin in disbelief, and Alan wore an expression of comical shock. Everyone present seemed taken aback by the offer. It was clear Quentin was giving Julian significant odds by allowing the successive doubling. In the end, it felt like he would surely lose. I believe Stanford would have spoken up if Julian hadn't snatched the cards from the table and started shuffling them. 4,000 it is, he declared, laying the deck down and making the cut. He flipped over the Queen of Diamonds. "You can't top that card, absolutely not." His spirits lifted suddenly. "I suppose you're right," Quentin replied softly, cutting a tray. "Want to keep going?" Julian asked, playfully challenging him. "That's enough for me." Quentin appeared disinterested. "It's far too thrilling. I lack your iron constitution, you know." He walked over to the desk and wrote Julian a check for $1,000. Then he turned to Stanford and extended his hand. "I had a wonderful evening and all that. And remember, we're having lunch together tomorrow. 1 o'clock at the club, right?" Stanford paused for a moment. "If nothing comes up." "But really, it can't," Quentin insisted. "You have no idea how much you want to see me." He was unusually quiet and pensive on the ride home. I couldn't pry any explanations out of him, but when he said good night, he added, "There's a crucial piece of the puzzle still missing, and until it's found, nothing makes sense." Chapter 28. The Guilty Man. Tuesday, June 18, 1 p.m. Quentin slept in the next morning, spending the hour before lunch perusing a catalogue of ceramics that were set to be auctioned the following day at the Anderson Galleries. At 1 o'clock, we walked into the Beaumont Club and joined Stanford in the grill. "The lunch is on you, my friend," Quentin said playfully, "but I'll keep it simple. All I want is some English bacon, a cup of coffee, and a croissant." Stanford gave him a teasing smile. "It's no wonder you're trying to save a few pennies after your bad luck last night." Quentin raised his eyebrows. "I actually thought my luck was rather extraordinary." "You had 4 of a kind twice, and lost both times." "Well, you see," Quentin replied, his tone nonchalant, "I knew exactly what cards my opponents were holding both times." Stanford stared at him, surprised. "That's correct," Quentin continued. "I had arranged to have those particular hands dealt prior to the game." He smiled innocently. "I must commend you, old chap, on your restraint in not mentioning my rather unique guest, Mr. Allen, whom I shamefully introduced so abruptly into your gathering. I owe you both an explanation and an apology. Mr. Allen isn't what you would call a pleasant companion. He lacks the refined qualities of our class, and his display of jewelry was a bit over the top, though I must admit I preferred his diamond studs over his garish tie. However, Mr. Allen does have his merits. He certainly does. He's up there with Andy Blakely, Canfield, and honest John Kelly as an indoor soldier of fortune. In fact, our Mr. Allen is none other than Doc Wiley Allen, a name that many may remember. Doc Allen, not the infamous crook who ran the El Dorado Club. The very same. And incidentally, he's one of the most skilled card manipulators in what was once a lucrative but dubious profession. You mean that this Allen man cheated at cards last night? Stanford asked, his voice filled with indignation. Only in the 2 hands you mentioned. If I remember correctly, Allen was the dealer both times. I, who deliberately sat at his right side, made sure to shuffle the cards just as he instructed. And really, you have to admit that there's no real blame to assign to my trickery, since the only ones benefiting from Allen's schemes were Brady and Trafford. Even though Allen dealt me 4 of a kind every time, I ended up losing quite a bit on both occasions. Stanford looked at Quentin for a moment, puzzled, then laughed warmly. You seemed to be in a generous mood last night. You practically handed Julian $1,000 by letting him double the stakes on every draw. That seems a bit foolish, I must say. It all comes down to perspective, you know, despite my losses, which, by the way, I fully intend to bill to your office expenses. The game was quite successful. You see, I achieved the main goal of my evening. Oh, I remember, Stanford said vaguely, as if the matter, being of little consequence, had temporarily slipped his mind. I believe you were going to find out who murdered the Simon girl. Impressive memory. Yes, I hinted that I might be able to shed some light on the situation today. And who am I supposed to arrest? Quentin took a sip of his coffee and lit a cigarette slowly. I'm quite sure you won't believe me, he replied in a calm, matter-of-fact tone. But it was Trafford who killed the girl. You don't say, Stanford said with unmistakable sarcasm. So it was Trafford. My dear Quentin, you've truly astonished me. I'd call Oscar right away to sharpen his handcuffs, but sadly, miracles, like strangling someone from across town, aren't exactly feasible in this day and age. Shall I get you another croissant? Quentin threw his hands up in an exaggerated gesture of exasperation. For an educated, civilized man, Stanford, there's something shockingly primitive about the way you cling to illusions. I must say, you remind me of a child who truly believes a magician pulls a rabbit from his top hat just because he sees it happen. Now you're being rude. Indeed, Quentin agreed cheerfully, but we need to take some drastic measures to free you from the snare of legal facts. You're far too lacking in imagination, my dear fellow. I take it you want me to close my eyes and imagine Trafford sitting upstairs in the Beaumont Club, reaching out towards 71st Street. But I simply can't do that. I'm an ordinary guy. Such a thought seems utterly ridiculous. It feels like something out of a drugged dream. You don't indulge in any sort of narcotics, do you? But that way the notion does seem a bit surreal. And yet, certum est queer impossibile est. I rather fancy that saying, you know, because in this case the impossible is indeed true. Oh, Trafford is guilty, there's no doubt. And I'm going to hold on to that seemingly absurd notion. Moreover, I intend to draw you into this web, for your own, how shall I put it, reputation is at stake. As things stand, Stanford, you're currently protecting the true murderer from being exposed. Quentin spoke with a confidence that brooked no argument. I could see the shift in Stanford's expression, indicating he was taken aback. Tell me, he said, what led you to your wild belief in Trafford's guilt? Quentin extinguished his cigarette and crossed his arms on the table. We start with my list of 4 suspects, Julian, Brady, Jensen, and Trafford. Knowing the crime was meticulously plotted with the intent to kill, I realized that only someone hopelessly caught in the lady's charm could have executed it. No outsider from my list could have been ensnared in that way, or we would have heard about him. Therefore, one of those 4 must be responsible. Jensen was ruled out when we learned he had been confined to a hospital at the time of Porter's murder. After all, it's clear that the same person committed both crimes. But, Stanford interrupted, Trafford had just as good an alibi for the night of the Cardinal's murder. Why dismiss one and not the other? I'm afraid I can't agree with you on that. Being incapacitated in a verified location, surrounded by honest and impartial witnesses both before and during the event, is one thing. But actually being on the scene, as Trafford was that fateful evening, just minutes before the lady was murdered, and then spending about 15 minutes alone in a taxi afterward, that's an entirely different matter. No one, as far as we know, actually saw the lady alive after Trafford left. But the evidence that she was alive and spoke to him is indisputable. True, I concede that a dead woman doesn't scream for help and then have a conversation with her murderer. I understand, Stanford said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. You believe it was Porter using a disguise. Good heavens, no. What a ridiculous idea. Porter wouldn't want anyone to know he was there. Why would he create such a foolish spectacle? That certainly isn't the answer. When we uncover the truth, it will be reasonable and straightforward. That's reassuring, Stanford smiled. But go on with your reasoning for Trafford's guilt. Let's consider 3 of my suspects as potential murderers, Quentin continued. So, I arranged for a casual evening together, hoping to examine them more closely under the psychological lens, so to speak. While Trafford's background made him a plausible suspect, I admit I was leaning toward Brady or Julian as the actual culprit. Either of them could have crossed the line without contradicting anything we know about the circumstances. Hence, when Julian declined your invitation to play poker last night, I decided to put Brady to the first test. I signaled Mr. Allen stepped in and quickly began his first act of sleight of hand. Quentin paused and looked up. You remember the circumstances. It turned out to be quite the event. Allen dealt Brady a 4 straight flush and gave me 3 kings. The rest of the hands were so weak that everyone else had no choice but to fold. I made the first move, and Brady stayed in. When we drew cards, Allen gave me another king and handed Brady the card he needed to complete his straight flush. I placed a small bet twice, and both times Brady raised me. Finally, I called his bet, and of course he won. He couldn't help but win, you see. He was betting on a sure thing. Since I had opened the pot and drew 2 cards, the best hand I could have held was 4 of a kind. Brady understood this, and having a straight flush, he knew before he raised my bet that he had me beat. Right then, I realized he wasn't the man I was after. What made you think that? Stanford asked. A poker player who bets on a sure thing lacks the ego and confidence of a truly skilled gambler. He's not someone who takes risks. Instead, he has what the analysts might call an inferiority complex. He clings to every chance to protect and improve his position. In short, he's not the ultimate gamble. The man who killed the Simon girl was a true gambler, one who would risk everything on a single turn of the wheel. In committing that crime, he did just that. Only someone whose overwhelming self-confidence and arrogance would prevent him from betting on a sure thing could have done what he did. So, Brady was ruled out as a suspect. Stanford was now listening closely. The test I set for Trafford a bit later, Quentin continued, was originally meant for Julian, but he was out of the game. That didn't matter, though, because if I had managed to get rid of both Brady and Trafford, then Julian would surely have been the guilty one. Of course, I would have found another way to prove it, but as things stood, that wasn't necessary. The test I put to Trafford was pretty much explained by the man himself. As he said, not one player in 1,000 would dare to bet the limit against a strong hand when they held nothing. It was incredible, astonishing. It was perhaps the most remarkable bluff ever made in a poker game. I couldn't help but admire him as he confidently pushed all his chips forward, aware, as I was, that he had nothing. He staked everything, you see, entirely on his belief that he could follow my reasoning step by step, and in the end, outsmart me. It took guts and boldness to do that. It also required a level of self-confidence that would never allow him to bet on a sure thing. The psychological principles at play in that hand were identical to those in the Simon case. I threatened Trafford with a powerful hand, a strong hand, just as the girl had likely threatened him, and instead of backing down, instead of calling my bet or folding, he went all in. He made one final move, even though it meant risking everything. My word, Stanford, don't you see how the man's character, revealed through that incredible act, aligns with the psychology of the crime? Stanford was quiet for a moment, seemingly deep in thought. But you yourself, Quentin, were not convinced at the time, he finally said. In fact, you looked doubtful and anxious. True, my friend, I was quite worried. The psychological evidence of Trafford's guilt appeared so unexpectedly, I wasn't prepared for it, you see. After eliminating Brady, I had a bias, so to speak, regarding Julian, all the material evidence suggesting Trafford's innocence. That is, the apparent physical impossibility of him having strangled the woman did impress me. I'm not infallible, you know. Being only human, I remain vulnerable to the deceptive allure of facts and appearances that you lawyers seem to spread everywhere like a suffocating fog. Even when I discovered that Trafford's psychological profile aligned perfectly with all the aspects of the crime, I still had lingering doubts about Julian. It was conceivable that he could have played his hand in the same manner as Trafford. That's why, after the game concluded, I confronted him about gambling. I needed to observe his psychological responses. Still, he risked everything on a single roll of the wheel, as you describe it. Ah, but not in the same way that Trafford did. Julian is more cautious and hesitant as a gambler compared to Trafford. For one, he had an equal shot and a fair bet, while Trafford had no chance at all. His hand was worthless. And yet Trafford put everything on the line based solely on a mental calculation. That was gambling at a higher level. In contrast, Julian was merely flipping a coin with an even chance of winning. Moreover, there was no calculation to it, no strategy, no analysis, no audacity. As I've mentioned from the beginning, the murder of Simon was premeditated and meticulously planned with clever strategy and boldness. And what true gambler would ask an opponent to double a bet on the second coin flip, only to accept an offer to double it again on the third flip? I deliberately tested Julian to eliminate any chance of error. In doing so, I not only ruled him out, I completely erased him, wiped him from the equation. It cost me $1,000, but it cleared my mind of any remaining doubt. I was certain, despite all the contrary evidence, that Trafford had killed the woman. You present your argument as theoretically sound. But honestly, I can't accept that. Stanford seemed more impressed than he wanted to show. Damn it, man, he burst out after a moment. Your conclusion destroys every established principle of rationality and sound credibility. Just think about the facts. He had now entered the argumentative phase of his skepticism. You claim Trafford is guilty, yet we know beyond doubt that just 5 minutes after he left the apartment, the girl screamed and called for help. He was at the switchboard, and with Harley, he went to the door and had a brief conversation with her. She was undoubtedly alive then. After that, he walked out the front door, got into a cab, and drove away. 15 minutes later, he met Judge Redfern as he stepped out of the cab in front of the club here, nearly 40 blocks from the apartment. There's no way he could have made that trip in such a short time. We also have the cab driver's record to confirm it. Trafford simply did not have the opportunity or the time to commit the murder between 11:30 and 10 minutes to 12 when Judge Redfern met him. And remember, he played poker at the club until 3 in the morning, well after the murder occurred. Stanford shook his head emphatically. Quentin, there's no way to get around those facts. They're solid. They clear Trafford of guilt as surely as if he were at the North Pole that night. Quentin remained unmoved. I acknowledge everything you say, he replied. But as I've mentioned before, when tangible facts clash with psychological ones, the tangible facts are misleading. They may not be wrong, but they can definitely be deceptive. Very well, oh wise one. The situation proved too much for Stanford's frayed nerves. Show me how Trafford could have strangled the girl and ransacked the apartment, and I'll have Oscar arrest him. Honestly, I can't do that, Quentin protested. I was not granted omniscience, but good heavens, I think I've done quite well pointing out the real culprit. I never agreed to explain his methods, you know. So, is this what your so-called insight amounts to? Well, well, here and now I will proclaim myself a professor of advanced mental sciences, and I solemnly declare that Dr. Crippen murdered the Simon girl. True, Crippen's dead, but that doesn't stop me from using my freshly adopted methods of deduction. Crippen's character, you see, aligns perfectly with all the obscure hints surrounding the crime. Tomorrow, I'll request an exhumation order. Quentin glanced at him with playful reproach and sighed. It seems that recognition of my extraordinary genius is destined to be posthumous. Omnia post arbitum fingit majora vedastas. In the meantime, I endure the scorn and mockery of the masses with a brave heart. My head may be bloodied, but it remains unbowed. He checked his watch and appeared to drift into deep thought. Stanford, he said after several moments, I have a concert at 3 o'clock, but there's an hour to spare. I want to take another look at that apartment and its various entrances. Trafford's trick, if you can even call it that, was staged there, and if we are ever to uncover the truth, we need to investigate the scene. I had the feeling that, despite his strong denial of Trafford's guilt, Stanford was not completely convinced, so I was not surprised when he reluctantly agreed to Quentin's idea of revisiting the Simon apartment. Chapter 29. Beethoven, Andante. Tuesday, June 18, 2 p.m. Less than 30 minutes later, we stepped back into the main hall of the small apartment building on 71st Street. Spively was at the switchboard as usual. Just inside the reception room, the guard lounged in an easy chair, a cigar resting between his lips. Upon spotting the district attorney, he sprang up with a forced enthusiasm. "When are you going to get things moving, Mr. Stanford? This waiting is driving me mad." "Very soon, I hope, officer," Stanford replied. "Any more visitors?" "None, sir." The man suppressed a yawn. "Let have your key to the apartment. Have you been inside?" "No, sir. Orders were to stay out here." We entered the dead girl's living room. The blinds were still up, allowing the bright midday sun to flood the space. Nothing seemed to have been disturbed. Even the displaced chairs remained as they were. Stanford walked to the window, standing with his hands behind his back, taking in the scene with a growing sense of unease. He observed Quentin with a sort of cynical amusement that felt forced. Quentin lit a cigarette and began to explore the two rooms, his gaze scrutinizing the various disordered items scattered about. Soon he wandered into the bathroom and lingered there for several minutes. When he emerged, he held a towel marked with dark smudges. "This is what Porter used to wipe away his fingerprints," he said, tossing the towel onto the bed. "Fantastic," Stanford teased. "That, of course, clears Trafford." "Oh, but it does help support my theory of the crime." He approached the dressing table and took a sniff from a small silver atomizer. "The lady used Cody's chiper," he murmured. "Why does everyone do this?" "And how does that help prove your point?" "Stanford, dear, I'm soaking in the atmosphere. I'm tuning my spirit to the apartment's energy. Please allow me to tune in peace. I could receive a visitor at any moment, a revelation from Sinai, so to speak." He continued his thorough investigation and eventually stepped into the main hall, where he stood, one foot propping open the door, scanning the surroundings with keen interest. When he returned to the living room, he perched on the edge of the rosewood table, sinking into dark thoughts. After a few minutes, he glanced at Stanford with a sardonic smile. "I tell you, this is quite the dilemma. It's downright eerie. I figured sooner or later you'd revisit your conclusions about Trafford," Stanford scoffed. Quentin gazed idly at the ceiling. "You're annoyingly obstinate, you know. Here I am, trying to pull you out of a rather unpleasant situation, and all you do is throw out sarcastic remarks that only serve to quench my youthful enthusiasm." Stanford left the window and sat on the arm of the davenport, facing Quentin. Worry was etched across his face. "Quentin, don't misunderstand me. Trafford doesn't matter to me at all. If he's guilty of this crime, I want to know. Unless this case is resolved, I'm facing a relentless onslaught from the newspapers. It's not in my interest to suppress any chance of a solution. But your theory about Trafford is simply impossible. There are too many conflicting facts." "That's precisely the point, you see. The contradictions are too perfect. They fit together too elegantly. They're almost as exquisite as a Michelangelo statue. They're too intricately aligned to be merely a random twist of fate. They point to a deliberate design." Stanford stood up and, slowly returning to the window, stared out into the small backyard. "If I could accept your premise that Trafford killed the girl," he said, "then I could follow your reasoning. But I can't convict a man simply because his defense appears too flawless. What we need, Stanford, is some inspiration. The mere antics of a prophetess won't suffice." Quentin paced the room. "What really infuriates me is that I've been outmaneuvered. And by a manufacturer of automobile accessories. How utterly embarrassing." He settled onto the piano bench and started playing the opening notes of Brahms's Capriccio, No. 1. "Needs some tuning," he muttered, then wandered over to the Boule cabinet, running his fingers along its intricate marquetry. "It's beautiful, but a bit overdone. Still, it's a fine piece. The deceased's aunt from Seattle should fetch a decent price for it. His gaze landed on a dangling girandole beside the cabinet. That's rather lovely, though a shame the original candles were replaced with those frosted bulbs. He paused in front of the little china clock on the mantel. Gingerbread. I can only imagine it kept terrible time. Moving on to the escritoire, he inspected it with a discerning eye. Imitation French Renaissance, sure, but quite charming, don't you think? His attention shifted to the waste paper basket, and he picked it up. What a silly idea, making a basket out of vellum. I bet it's the artistic triumph of some lady interior decorator. There's enough vellum here to bind a complete set of Epictetus. But why ruin the look with hand-painted garlands? There's clearly no appreciation for aesthetics in these fair states. Certainly not. After setting down the basket, he studied it for a moment in contemplation. Then he leaned over and retrieved the crumpled wrapping paper he had mentioned the day before. This must have held the lady's last purchase on Earth, he mused. Very touching. Are you sentimental about such things, Stanford? Anyway, the purple string was quite useful for Porter. What trinket do you suppose led to the frantic Tony's escape? He unwrapped the paper, revealing a broken piece of corrugated cardboard and a large, dark brown envelope. Ah, phonograph records. He glanced around the apartment. But where did the lady keep the darn machine? You'll find it in the foyer, said Stanford wearily, without looking up. He understood that Quentin's chatter was merely a sign of the serious and troubled thoughts churning in his mind, and he waited as patiently as he could. Quentin strolled casually through the glass doors into the small reception hall and found himself staring blankly at a console phonograph designed in the Chinese Chippendale style, which stood against the wall at one end. The chunky cabinet was partially draped with a prayer rug, and on it rested a polished bronze flower bowl. Well, it certainly doesn't look like a phonograph, he said. But what's with the prayer rug? He examined it casually. Anatolian, probably labeled a Caesarean for the sake of selling. Not very valuable, too reminiscent of the Aushak style. I wonder what kind of music the lady preferred. Victor Herbert, no doubt. He pulled back the rug and lifted the lid of the cabinet. There was already a record on the machine, and he leaned over to take a look at it. Goodness, the Andante from Beethoven's C minor symphony, he exclaimed cheerfully. You know the movement, Stanford. It's the most perfect Andante ever composed. He wound up the machine. I think some good music might lighten the mood and help us relax, don't you think? Stanford didn't respond to his light-heartedness. He continued to gaze out the window, looking quite dejected. Quentin started the motor, placed the needle on the record, and returned to the living room. He stood there, staring at the davenport, concentrating on the problem at hand. I sat in the wicker chair by the door, waiting for the music. The situation was getting to me, and I started to feel restless. A minute or two passed, but the only sound coming from the phonograph was a faint scratching. Quentin looked up with mild curiosity and walked back to the machine. Giving it a quick inspection, he tried starting it again. But despite waiting several minutes, no music played. Now that's a bit strange, don't you think? He muttered, grumbling as he changed the needle and rewound the motor. Stanford had left the window by now and was watching him with a friendly kind of patience. The turntable of the phonograph was spinning, and the needle was tracing its circular path, but still the device refused to produce any sound. Quentin leaned forward, both hands resting on the cabinet, his eyes glued to the spinning record, wearing an expression that mixed amusement with confusion. The sound box must be broken, he said disdainfully. These machines are ridiculous anyway. The real issue, I think, Stanford replied with a hint of mockery, is your upper-class ignorance of such a straightforward and democratic device. Let me help you. He moved beside Quentin, while I stood curiously peering over his shoulder. Everything seemed to be in order, and the needle was nearing the end of the record. Yet all we could hear was a faint scratching sound. Stanford reached to lift the sound box, but his action halted unexpectedly. At that moment, the small room was suddenly filled with a series of piercing screams, followed by 2 urgent calls for help. A chill ran down my spine, and I felt a tingling sensation at the back of my neck. After a brief silence, where we 3 stood in stunned silence, a calm female voice cut through the tension, saying clearly, "No, nothing is wrong, I'm sorry. Everything is fine. Please go home and don't worry." The needle had just finished its cycle. There was a soft click, and the automatic device switched off. The heavy silence that followed was broken by Quentin's dry chuckle. "Well, my dear," he said casually, as he wandered back into the living room, "that's quite a blow to your supposed facts." There was a loud knock at the door, and an officer on duty peeked in, looking alarmed. "It's all right," Stanford told him in a low voice. "I'll call you when I need you." Quentin flopped down on the davenport and pulled out another cigarette. After lighting it, he stretched his arms high above his head and extended his legs, as if a sudden wave of relaxation had washed over him. "Goodness, Stanford, we've all been fools in this situation," he drawled. "An unassailable alibi, my word. If the law believes that, as Mr. Bumble said, the law is an ass, a fool. Oh, Sammy, why wasn't there an alibi? Stanford, I feel embarrassed to say it, but it's us who have been absolute fools." Stanford had been standing by the machine, looking dazed, his gaze fixed intently on the revealing record. Slowly, he wandered into the room and collapsed wearily into a chair. "Those so-called facts of yours," Quentin went on, "when you strip away the careful facade, what do you really have? Trafford made a phonograph record, a pretty straightforward job. People do it all the time now." "Yes, he mentioned having a workshop at his home on Long Island, where he dabbled a bit. He didn't actually need it, you know, but it surely made things easier. The voice on the record is just his own in a falsetto, better for the purpose than a woman's, since it's stronger and more penetrating. As for the label, he simply soaked it off an ordinary record and glued it onto his. That night, he brought the lady several new records and slipped this one among them. After the theater, he staged his gruesome little play and carefully set things up so that the police would assume it was a typical burglary. Once all was arranged, he placed the record on the machine, started it, and casually walked out. He had laid the prayer rug and bronze bowl on the cabinet of the machine to give the impression that the phonograph was rarely used. And it worked. No one thought to investigate. Why would they? Then he asked Harley to get a taxi. Everything seemed perfectly normal, you see. While he was waiting for the car, the needle hit the recorded screams. They were loud and clear. It was night, and the sounds traveled distinctly. Plus, filtered through a wooden door, the phonographic quality was well disguised. And if you notice, the enclosed horn was directed toward the door, just 3 feet away. But how did he time his questions with the answers on the record? That part was the easiest. You'll recall that Harley told us Trafford was standing with one arm on the switchboard when the screams were heard. He just kept an eye on his watch. As soon as he heard the scream, he timed it with the record and asked his question to the imaginary lady at the perfect moment to catch the record's reply. He must have planned it all out in advance. It seemed he had practiced it in his lab. It was quite straightforward and nearly foolproof. The record was large, about 12 inches across, and it took roughly 5 minutes for the needle to play through. By placing the screams at the end, he allowed himself plenty of time to step out and call for a taxi. When the car finally arrived, he went straight to the Beaumont Club, where he met Judge Redfern and played poker until 3 in the morning. Had he not run into the judge, you can be sure he would have made his presence felt elsewhere to create an alibi. Stanford shook his head solemnly. Good grief, no wonder he kept pressing me to let him return to this apartment again. That record must have haunted him at night. Yet I suspect that if I hadn't found it, he would have managed to get hold of it as soon as your police officer left. It was frustrating being unexpectedly locked out of the apartment, but I doubt it fazed him too much. He would have been there when the Cardinal's aunt took over, and retrieving the record would have been relatively simple. Of course, the record posed a risk, but Trafford isn't the kind to shy away from hazards like that. No, the whole thing was planned out smartly enough. He was thwarted by sheer chance. And Porter. He was another unfortunate turn of events. He was hiding in the closet when Trafford and the lady arrived at 11. He saw Trafford strangle his former lover and ransack the apartment. Then, once Trafford left, he emerged from his hiding spot. He was probably looking down at the girl when the phonograph let out those chilling wails. Goodness. Imagine being stuck in a cold funk, staring at a murdered woman, and suddenly hearing blood-curdling screams behind you. Even for someone as tough as Tony, that was a bit much. It's no surprise he lost all composure and braced himself on the table. Then came Trafford's voice through the door, followed by the record's answer. That must have thrown Porter off guard. For a moment, I bet he thought he was losing his mind. But soon enough, the meaning of it clicked. I can picture him smirking to himself. Of course, he knew who the murderer was. He couldn't have been oblivious to the identities of the Cardinal's admirers. And now he found himself with a golden opportunity for blackmail, a perfect gift that any charming young man could only dream of. I can just see him daydreaming about a life of luxury and comfort at Trafford's expense. When Brady called a few minutes later, he simply said the lady was out, and then got to work plotting his own escape. But why didn't he take the record with him and risk removing the one piece of undeniable evidence from the crime scene? Poor strategy, Stanford. If he had tried to present the record later, Trafford would just deny everything and accuse the blackmailer of a scheme. No, Porter had to abandon it and immediately look for a hefty settlement from Trafford. I imagine that's exactly what he did. Trafford likely gave him something up front and promised the rest later, hoping to retrieve the record in the meantime. When he didn't pay, Porter called you and threatened to spill everything, thinking that would push Trafford to act. Well, it did spur him, but not in the way he wanted. Trafford probably met him last Saturday night, apparently to hand over the money, but instead he ended up choking the guy. Quite fitting for his character, don't you think? A hefty fellow, that Trafford. It's all just astonishing. I wouldn't say that. Trafford faced a daunting task, and he approached it with a calm, logical, and straightforward mindset. He had concluded that his little Cardinal needed to be eliminated to restore his peace of mind. She had likely become quite bothersome. So he selected a date, much like a judge announcing a sentence, and then set about crafting an alibi. Being somewhat of a tinkerer, he devised a mechanical alibi. The plan was straightforward, lacking any twisted schemes or complications. It would have worked had it not been for what the insurance companies like to refer to as an act of God. No one can foresee accidents, Stanford. Otherwise, they wouldn't be accidents, would they? But Trafford took every precaution imaginable. He never considered that you would thwart his every attempt to return here and seize the record. Nor could he predict my choice in music or anticipate that I would seek comfort in it. Furthermore, when a gentleman calls on a lady, he doesn't expect another suitor to be hiding in the wardrobe. It simply isn't done. All in all, the poor fellow was ultimately defeated by a streak of terrible luck. You're ignoring the wickedness of the crime, Stanford chided him sharply. Don't be so shockingly moral, my dear. Everyone harbors a murderous inclination deep down. Anyone who has never felt a strong desire to kill someone is devoid of emotions. And do you really believe that ethics or religion prevent the average person from committing homicide? Not at all. It's fear. Fear of getting caught, of being haunted, of dealing with remorse. Just look at how eagerly people, specifically the state, execute sentences and then revel in the details in the newspapers. Nations go to war over the smallest provocations, just to unleash their thirst for bloodshed, without consequence. Trafford, I would say, is simply a rational being who has the courage to stand by his beliefs. Unfortunately, society isn't ready for your nihilistic views just yet, Stanford replied. And during this transitional period, we must safeguard human life. He stood up with determination and went to the phone to call Oscar. Sergeant, he instructed, get a John Doe warrant and meet me at the Beaumont Club right away. Bring someone along. There's an arrest to make. Finally, the law has some evidence it can really work with, Quentin quipped, as he nonchalantly put on his overcoat and grabbed his hat and cane. Your legal process is quite a spectacle, Stanford. Scientific understanding, the principles of psychology, mean nothing to you learned gentlemen. But a phonograph recording. There's something that's undeniable, conclusive, isn't it? As we stepped out, Stanford signaled to the officer stationed by the door. Under no circumstances, he stated firmly. Is anyone to enter this apartment until I return, not even with a signed permit? Once we were in the taxi, he instructed the driver to head to the club. So the newspapers are clamoring for action, are they? Well, they're about to get it. You've really helped me out of a difficult situation, my friend. As he spoke, his gaze shifted to Quentin, and that look carried a depth of gratitude that words could never convey. Chapter 30. The End. Tuesday, June 18, 3:30 p.m. It was exactly 3:30 when we stepped into the rotunda of the Beaumont Club. Stanford promptly requested the manager and held a brief private conversation with him. After a few moments, the manager hurried off, returning about 5 minutes later. "Mr. Trafford is in his room," he reported to Stanford. "I sent the electrician up to check the light bulbs. He says the gentleman is alone, writing at his desk." "And what's the room number?" 341. The manager looked uneasy. "There won't be any trouble, will there, Mr. Stanford?" "I don't expect any," Stanford replied, his tone icy. "However, what we're dealing with right now is far more significant than your club." "What an exaggerated perspective," Quentin remarked after the manager left us. "I'd say arresting Trafford is the height of absurdity. The man isn't a criminal. He doesn't resemble Lombroso's Uomo delinquent at all. He's more of a philosophically behaviorist." Stanford grunted but didn't reply. He started pacing back and forth, his gaze fixed anxiously on the main entrance. Quentin settled into a nearby chair, looking completely untroubled. 10 minutes later, Oscar and Barron arrived. Stanford immediately ushered them into an alcove and briefly explained the situation. "Trafford's upstairs now," he said. "I want the arrest to be as quiet as possible." "Trafford," Oscar echoed in surprise. "I don't understand." "You don't need to understand. Yet," Stanford interjected sharply. "I'm taking full responsibility for the arrest, and you'll get the credit if that's what you want. Does that work for you?" Oscar shrugged, looking puzzled. "It's fine with me, sir, but what about Harley?" "We'll keep him locked up. He's a material witness." We took the elevator to the 3rd floor and stepped out. Trafford's rooms were at the end of the hall, facing the square. Stanford, his expression serious, led the way. In response to his knock, Trafford opened the door and greeted us warmly, stepping aside to let us in. "Any news?" he asked, pulling a chair forward. At that moment, he caught sight of Stanford's face in the light, and his expression shifted as he realized the serious nature of our visit. Though his face remained unchanged, I noticed his body tense up. His cold, unreadable eyes scanned Stanford's face, then moved over to Oscar and Barron. Finally, his gaze landed on Quentin and me, standing slightly behind the others, and he acknowledged us with a stiff nod. Silence filled the room, yet I felt an entire drama unfolding, with each person silently understanding every unspoken word. Stanford stood still, hesitating to move forward. Of all the responsibilities he held, I knew that arresting criminals weighed the most heavily on him. He was a sophisticated man, accustomed to the world's darker corners and the way it handled injustice. Oscar and Barron stepped up, poised and waiting for the district attorney's command to execute the warrant. Trafford's eyes returned to Stanford. "What can I do for you, sir?" he asked, his tone calm and steady. "You will accompany these officers, Mr. Trafford," Stanford replied quietly, nodding slightly toward the 2 unflappable figures beside him. "I'm arresting you for the murder of Eleanor Simon." "Ah," Trafford raised his eyebrows slightly. "So you've found something." "The Beethoven Andante." Not a muscle in Trafford's face moved, but after a moment he gave a barely noticeable indication of resignation. "I can't say I'm surprised," he said evenly, a tragic hint of a smile on his lips. "Especially since you blocked every attempt I made to secure the record, but then the outcome of the game is always unpredictable." His smile faded, and his demeanor turned serious. "You have been generous with me, Mr. Stanford, in protecting me from the riffraff, and because I appreciate that kindness, I want you to understand that the decision I made was one where I had no real choice. Your motive, however strong, doesn't excuse your actions, Stanford replied. Do you really think I seek an excuse? Trafford waved off the accusation with disdain. I'm not a child. I weighed the consequences of my actions carefully, and after considering all the factors, I chose to go for it. It was a gamble, I won't deny that, but I don't believe in whining about the fallout from a calculated risk. Besides, I felt there was no real choice. If I hadn't taken this gamble, I would have faced significant losses anyway. His expression turned bitter. This woman, Mr. Stanford, demanded the impossible of me. Not only did she drain my finances, but she also wanted legal protection, status, social standing, things that only my name could provide her. She insisted that I divorce my wife and marry her. Can you grasp the magnitude of that demand? You see, Mr. Stanford, I love my wife and my children dearly. I don't want to insult your intelligence by explaining how such a thing could be possible, given my actions. Yet this woman ordered me to destroy my life and utterly harm those I cherish, all to satisfy her trivial, selfish ambitions. When I refused, she threatened to expose our affair to my wife, to send her copies of my letters, and to sue me openly, essentially to create a scandal that would ruin me, disgrace my family, and destroy my home. He paused, taking a deep breath. I have never been one for half measures, he continued with an even tone. I'm not good at compromise. Maybe it's part of my nature. But my instinct is to see a challenge through to the end, to confront whatever danger lies ahead. Just a week ago, for a fleeting 5 minutes, I grasped how the zealots of the past could calmly inflict pain on those they considered threats to their souls. I chose the only path that might protect those I care for from shame and suffering. It involved a reckless gamble, but the passion within me was such that I did not hesitate. I was driven by the anguish of a profound hatred. I risked everything, wagering my life against a living death, all for a distant hope of finding peace, and in the end I lost. He managed a faint smile. Yes, the whims of fate, but don't for a second think I'm complaining or fishing for sympathy. I may have deceived others, but not myself. I can't stand people who whine or make excuses. I want you to fully understand that. He reached for a small, limp-leather book on the table beside him. Just last night I was reading Wilder, De Profundis. If I had the gift of words, perhaps I could have expressed a similar sentiment. Let me share a passage with you, so you won't think me cowardly in the face of my own truth. He opened the book and began to read in a voice filled with intensity that hushed us all. I brought about my own downfall. No one, regardless of their status, can ruin you like you can ruin yourself. As readily as I admit this, I know many will hear my words with skepticism. And though I mercilessly accuse myself, remember that I do so without offering any excuses. The punishment this world has dealt me is severe, but the destruction I've inflicted on myself is far worse. As I entered manhood, I realized my standing. I held a respected name and an esteemed place in society. Then came the pivotal moment. I grew weary of the heights and willingly descended into despair. I pursued my desires wherever they led me and simply moved on. I forgot that every single action, no matter how trivial, shapes our character in some way, and everything that happens in the privacy of our rooms will eventually be shouted from the rooftops. I lost control. I was no longer steering my own ship, and I didn't even realize it. I had become a captive of my own desires. The only thing left for me is utter humility. He tossed the book aside. Are you beginning to understand now, Mr. Stanford? Stanford was silent for several moments. Would you like to tell me about Porter? He finally asked. That pig, Trafford spat, his disdain clear. I could wipe out vermin like him every day and see it as a service to humanity. Yes, I killed him, and I would have done so sooner if I had the chance. It was Porter who was hiding in the closet when I returned to my apartment after the theater, and he must have seen me murder the woman. If I had known he was behind that locked door, I would have broken it down and taken care of him then. But how could I have known? It seemed perfectly natural for a closet to be locked. I didn't even think about it. The next night, he called me at the club here. He had first tried my home on Long Island and found out I was staying here. I had never seen him before, had no idea he existed. But apparently he had learned about me. Likely some of the money I gave to the woman ended up in his hands. What a pit I had stumbled into. When he called, he mentioned the phonograph, and I realized he had uncovered something important. I met him in the Waldorf lobby, and he spoke the truth. There was no doubt about it. Once he saw I believed him, he asked for an outrageous amount of money that left me reeling. Trafford lit a cigarette with steady hands. Mr. Stanford, I'm no longer a wealthy man. The reality is, I'm on the brink of financial ruin. The business my father left me has been in a receiver's hands for almost a year now. The Long Island estate where I live belongs to my wife. Not many people are aware of these details, but sadly, they're true. It would have been entirely impossible for me to pay the amount Porter demanded, even if I had been inclined to take the easy way out. Still, I did manage to give him a small sum to keep him quiet for a few days, promising to give him everything he asked for as soon as I could liquidate some of my assets. In the meantime, I hoped to gain possession of the record and thus outsmart him. However, that plan failed. So, when he threatened to reveal everything, I agreed to bring the money to his home late last Saturday night. I showed up as scheduled, fully intending to kill him. I was careful entering, and he had made it easier by telling me exactly when and how I could get in without being detected. Once inside, I wasted no time. The moment he was off guard, I seized him and took a perverse satisfaction in it. Then I locked the door, pocketed the key, and walked out of the house without anyone noticing, coming back here to the club. That's all there is to it, I believe. Quentin gazed at him thoughtfully. So, when you raised my bet last night, he said, that amount represented a crucial part of your finances. Trafford gave a faint smile. It represented nearly every dollar I had in the world. Remarkable. And would you mind if I asked why you chose Beethoven's Andante as your record label? Another error in judgment, the man replied wearily. I thought that if someone happened to open the phonograph before I could return and destroy the record, they wouldn't be as likely to want to hear classical music as they would a more popular tune. And someone who despises popular music ended up finding it. I'm afraid, Mr. Trafford, that fate dealt you a cruel hand. Yes. If I had any religious inclinations, I might ramble on about retribution and divine punishment. I'd like to ask you about the jewelry, Stanford said. It's not exactly proper to do this, and I wouldn't normally suggest it, but you've already admitted to the main points at hand. I have no objection to any questions you wish to pose, sir, Trafford replied. After I retrieved my letters from the document box, I turned the rooms upside down to create the illusion of a burglary, taking care to use gloves, naturally. I also took the woman's jewelry for the same reason. By the way, I had paid for most of it. I offered it as a peace offering to Porter, but he was too afraid to accept it. Ultimately, I decided to get rid of it. I wrapped it in one of the club newspapers and tossed it into a wastebasket near the Flatiron building. You wrapped it in the Morning Herald, Oscar interjected. Did you know that Pop Brady reads nothing but the Herald? Sergeant, Quentin interrupted sharply. Surely Mr. Trafford was not aware of that, otherwise he wouldn't have chosen the Herald. Trafford looked at Oscar with a mix of pity and disdain. Then, giving an appreciative glance at Quentin, he turned back to Stanford. About an hour after I got rid of the jewels, I was suddenly anxious that the package might be discovered and the paper traced back. So I bought another Herald and placed it on the rack. He paused. Is that all? Stanford nodded. Thank you, that's everything. However, I must now ask you to accompany these officers. In that case, Trafford said quietly, I have a small favor to ask of you, Mr. Stanford. Now that the situation has unfolded, I wish to write a note to my wife. I prefer to be alone while I do so. Surely you can understand that need. It won't take long. Your men may stand by the door. I can hardly escape. The victor can afford to be that generous. Before Stanford could respond, Quentin stepped closer and placed a hand on his arm. I hope, he said, that you won't feel the need to refuse Mr. Trafford's request. Stanford looked at him with uncertainty. "I suppose you've earned the right to call the shots, Quentin," he finally conceded. Then he instructed Oscar and Baron to wait in the hall as he, Quentin, and I moved into the next room. Stanford positioned himself near the door as if he were on guard, while Quentin ambled over to the window and peered out at Madison Square. "Goodness, Stanford," he exclaimed. "There's something quite impressive about that man. You can't help but admire him. He's so rational and composed." Stanford didn't respond. The hum of the city's mid-afternoon activities, muffled by the shut windows, seemed to amplify the heavy silence in the small room where we waited. Suddenly, a loud bang came from the other room. Stanford burst through the door, and Oscar and Baron were already rushing to Trafford's fallen body, bending over him as Stanford entered. Without a moment's pause, he turned and glared at Quentin, who had just appeared in the doorway. "He's shot himself." "Would you look at that?" said Quentin. Did you know he was going to do that?" Stanford stammered. "It was fairly obvious, don't you think?" Stanford's eyes sparked with anger. "And you knowingly stepped in to give him the chance." "Tut, tut, my good fellow," Quentin chided him. "Please don't succumb to conventional moral outrage. No matter how unethical, at least in theory, it may be to take a life, a person's own life is certainly theirs to do with as they wish. Suicide is his undeniable right, and under the paternal constraints of our modern democracy, I'm tempted to argue it's about the only right he has left. Wouldn't you agree?" He glanced at his watch, frowning. "Do you realize I've missed my concert meddling in your wretched affairs?" he said amiably, shooting Stanford a charming smile. "And now you're actually scolding me. Upon my word, old friend, you're quite ungrateful.